When the name Phil Anselmo was announced, the metal community hung its breath. His voice was more than simply noise when he was on stage. He was a ferocious animal, a symbol of uncontrollable rage, a shadow howling through smoke and lights, a weapon that slashed through everything. People referred to Phil Anselmo as the roar of 1990s metal, the heart and soul of Panta, and a powerful pulse of life pulsing through a world of darkness. However, beneath the blazing performances and multi-platinum singles was a broken soul, a guy in excruciating anguish, high on drugs, and alone in the spotlight. For saying words that could never be taken back, a man who died of an overdose was humiliated by everyone and expelled by his brothers. He spent years living as though he didn't want a future or that one didn't exist. The tale of Phil Anselmo was never flawless. The blackness did not frighten him. Sometimes he let it control him. His tale is worth recounting because of this. A journey of shattering, tumbling, rising, and remaining alive. Even if the world has changed, it continues to resound like a scream. What about you? Who are Selmo and Phil? The voice of a disobedient generation or the victim of the fire he started? A living legend or a spirit that has been banished and is still trying to find its way back? Early years. Hanson Philip Anselmo was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, on June 30th, 1968. Jazz music, freedom, turmoil, and fascinating individuals may all be found in New Orleans. His Italian-American father, Philip Anselmo, Sr., owned a classic Italian eatery, including live music. In contrast, his mother handled issues behind the scenes without voicing any concerns. Although the Anselmo family was not impoverished, their home was never quite loving enough. As one of 3 children, Phil witnessed the dissolution of his parents' marriage at a young age. His relationship with his father was not very tight. Although Phil grew up in his father's noisy, musically rich restaurant, he never considered it to be his stage. Rather, he frequently felt as though he didn't belong in any circumstance or fit in. Phil was an energetic, slender child who misbehaved and got into problems early on. He attended public elementary schools in New Orleans, but due to his disruptive nature and short fuse, he was frequently moved and disciplined. Although he didn't have the best marks, his unusual imagination and keen observational skills were undeniable. These would subsequently serve as the inspiration for his powerful and unexpectedly deep songs. Phil's early years were characterized by cacophony rather than art classes or athletic grounds. From his bedroom, he could escape the chaos outside by listening to heavy metal CDs by Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and Black Sabbath. Phil didn't pursue music as a hobby. "I was saved by that thing." He once claimed, "I didn't listen to metal for fun. I turned to metal because it screamed to me." When Phil first took up a guitar at the age of 14, his voice was what shaped him into the person he is today. Without any formal instruction or complex method, he began to scream. He experimented with tone, pronunciation, and the unfiltered rage that was raging within of him. He began playing in local bands around this time, such as Razor White and Sin, which are not the same as the band of the same name that Glenn Dancing leads. He instantly became the center of attention due to his bizarre stage appearance and frighteningly raw energy. In a place where jazz and funk were prevalent, Phil always felt out of place. He was different from the other children. He had no desire to pursue a career in medicine, engineering, or athletics. He decided to scream till the agony subsided while standing on stage and holding a microphone. Phil has no desire to be well known. It was already a struggle to stay alive. Then someone from Arlington, Texas called. Screams and late-night club appearances with a band that has released 3 albums but is still searching for the right singer characterized his adolescent years. A band that enjoyed the aesthetics of glam music but also aimed to be heavier, more realistic, and more frightening. Their name for him was Phil Anselmo. Early in the workday, at the age of 18, Phil Anselmo received an offer from the Texas band Panta in 1986. After becoming well-known in the glam metal genre, Panta was still attempting to establish themselves in the underground scene. They had released 3 independent albums and acquired some followers, but they lacked the most crucial component, a personality. When Phil entered the studio to try out, everything was different. He did not bring a star's light. He brought only a fundamental, angry, and wild spirit. Dimebag Darrell, the band's guitar virtuoso, recognized this as the element that was lacking immediately. A voice that wants to stand out rather than blend in with the throng. Phil was more than just a vocalist. No one could imitate or learn from his howl from the heart. He was a living statement. The first record Phil collaborated on with Panta was Power Metal, 1988, a piece of transitional music in which the band began to move in a completely different direction while retaining elements of their previous styles. Not a huge deal yet. The first step to shedding their glossy appearance, roughening up their sound, and venturing where few others ventured to go was Power Metal. The band's appearance and emotions were drastically altered when Phil joined. His gorgeous, long hair was chopped off. His eyes seemed to be able to devour the audience. He had tattoos all over his body, and he wore dark t-shirts and cargo pants. He was not merely a stage singer. He tore down the partition, separating him from the audience, screamed, and threatened. Rather than being frightened, the mob screamed back. Members of Panta sensed that the instrumental mood was shifting at the same moment. Glam had peaked and was beginning to decline. People desired something less polished, heavier, and more primal. Then, Panta changed their name because they felt like it, not because they believed it would benefit the market. In 1989, Panta signed with AKO Records, a major record label. It was more than a business transaction. They may make a fresh start and eventually emerge from their cloud. Then, in 1990, Cowboys from Hell was released. It was Pantera's debut album that truly demonstrated their newfound might in heavy metal. Cowboys from Hell would go on to be regarded as one of the decade's most significant albums. However, it was only the beginning when it was released, a pledge that Phil Anselmo would become the band's ruthless, cruel souls, and that Panta was prepared to burn the past and embark on a one-way journey. It would be a completely different scenario from the commercial explosion to the subsequent internal collapse. Phil felt that his transformation from a boisterous and disruptive young man in New Orleans to the lead singer of a new generation of metal bands was sufficient evidence. He revitalized Panta rather than merely joining it. Career breakthrough. In 1990, Panta released more than just Cowboys from Hell, their new album. They altered heavy metal's trajectory. The music was excellent, from Phil Anselmo's eerie guttural screams to Vinnie Paul's oppressively tight drums and Dimebag Darrell's razor-sharp riffs. Every section of the song has a different kind of excitement. It was metal that was more about intentional violence than merely speed. For those present, it was just the sound of the truth, even though it was referred to as groove metal. Raw, dark, and flawed. Phil's voice was distinct from everyone else's at that time. He didn't try to shock people by being strange, nor did he try to impress them with his sweet singing. His shouts had a wild force and emanated from the belly, as though each syllable was a blow to the chest. He was more than just a theater actor. He was a refugee. One injured combatant shouted into his scars, drawing attention to them until they ceased to move. Although Cowboys from Hell wasn't immediately popular, it quickly became extremely popular underground. Metal fans viewed Panta as the band of the future, and Phil was hailed as a model of unadulterated honesty in his emotions and lifestyle. No pretending, polishing, or playing is allowed. He was strong, honest, and unrepentant, just like himself. Panta returned to the studio in 1992 after nearly 2 years of nonstop playing. But this time, they wanted more than simply a follow-up. Their goal was to get into a brawl. Demonstration of strength. The outcome was one of the most significant records in the history of contemporary heavy metal. This album has it all, from the tense riff in Mouth for War to the suppressed boiling scream in This Love to the steadfast message of Walk. For a generation that had lost trust in the church, society, authority figures, and even the family, it was a call to action. Phil's songs were devoid of analogies. Many young people felt seen because he wrote as though he were removing his own skin at the microphone. The album Vulgar Show of Power was a huge hit. Panta performed at every significant metal festival. However, The release of Far Beyond Driven in 1994 marked their true zenith. The album was so dark and vicious that it was incomprehensible. Nevertheless, it immediately rose to the top. It was the first time in metal history that a band on the Billboard 200 outperformed punk, rock, and pop bands. However, that accomplishment came at a price. As the band grew stronger, Phil's situation deteriorated. Untreated back ailments, years of constant travel, and unhealing mental wounds drove him to the brink. To lessen the discomfort, he started taking powerful medications. When those failed, he resorted to narcotics. At first, nobody knew. When Phil stood on stage, he still led the audience like a crazed preacher and yelled like a wild beast. Things were less obvious behind the scenes. Dill's friendship with the Abbott brothers, Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul, started to deteriorate as he stopped attending interviews and spent more time apart from the band. They stopped writing songs together, but they continued to perform together and grin for the cameras. The beer conversations of the late night were over. Things ultimately fell apart on July 13, 1996, during a performance in Dallas. Hours after leaving the stage, Phil Anselmo overdosed on heroin and suffered a nearly 5-minute heart attack. The band thought he was gone forever. Phil, however, was still alive. Fans were terrified, and the news media was taken aback by the incident. But for Phil, it wasn't a wake-up call. His slow-motion suicide was just getting underway. Pantera released Great Southern Tranquilled Eye in a Strange Way, their darkest, most ominous, and most intimate LP, that same year. While the rest of the band performed in Texas, Phil recorded the majority of his vocals by himself in New Orleans. The fact that the bone was shattered inside was obvious. Although they were no longer a unified group, they were nevertheless referred to as Pantera on paper. The darkest aspects of Phil's thoughts were shown in songs like Floods and Suicide Note Part 1 and 2. The planet could no longer be attacked by the words. They resembled duplicates of the internal maelstrom that was destroying him. Those who listened carefully could sense it. Music was only one aspect of this. It was an appeal for assistance. There was a long hush after that. For a number of years, Pantera essentially stopped doing anything. Phil threw himself into side endeavors like superjoint ritual bands and Down, which tapped into a darker, more ominous, and threatening aspect of his sound. In the meantime, it was hard to overlook the distance between him and Dimebag Darrell. Their former fraternity disintegrated into distrust and then subdued animosity. When Pantera was formally dissolved in February 2003, there were no big news conferences or declarations made. Instead, it was a silent cut that hurt like a never-ending wound. Phil Anselmo, the man who had once given Pantera a soul, were now thought to be responsible for its demise. Career of Post-Pantera. There was no news conference, no farewell, and no explanation from Phil Anselmo following Pantera's unofficial split in February 2003. He just vanished. However, that quiet wasn't the end. Rather, it was a self-reflection and the start of a new path. One in which music became a confession, a lingering hurt, and a punishment he put on himself rather than a cry of fury against the world. As fans continued to mourn Pantera's passing, Phil was quietly constructing a new, rougher, more extreme, but more intimate empire. He rejoined Down, the band he had founded in the mid-1990s with close New Orleans friends like Jimmy Bower, Corrosion of Conformity, and Pepper Kinnon, I Hate God. NOLA, their 1995 debut album, was already regarded as a cult classic. However, it was during the post-Pant years that Phil really used Down as a medium to express all of his broken emotions through song. Pantera was not at all like Down. It did not burn or blaze. It was heavy, sorrowful, and dark as it crawled. It was sludge metal from the South, where grief moaned rather than screamed, where anger smoldered in your hand like fire rather than exploding. With songs such as Down 2, A Bustle in Your Hedgerow, February 2002, and Down 3, Over the Under, February 2007, Phil started narrating his life narrative through music rather than interviews or memoirs. The songs contain every riff, rhythm, and lengthy sigh. Phil also founded Superjoint Ritual, Cruder, in addition to Down. It was more chaotic and fierce than anything he had ever done. This was not a performance band. The Purge was what it was. Phil screamed about addiction, sleepless nights with no way out, and times when his heart stopped and he wasn't sure he'd wake up again in Superjoint, which felt like a foaming mouth. Listening to Superjoint's music was difficult. Acid was applied to a wound. However, it was the purest form of honesty for those who understood. He didn't stop there, either. Phil started a solo band called Philip H. Anselmo and the Illegals, in which he was in total charge of the lyrics, production, and marketing. Phil delved further than ever before into his turbulent inner world with songs like Choosing Mental Illness as a Virtue, February 2018, and Walk Through Exits Only, February 2013. There was more to the screams than just vocal style. Perhaps Phil's most understated but significant contribution after Pantera was the establishment of House of Records, a label that not only released his own music but also supported dozens of underground bands from genres like sludge, doom, and death metal. These were the cries of a man struggling with himself, asking, "Do I still deserve to be heard?" This was not an investment to him. It was a duty. He once said that if I've made it through everything, it is my duty to provide room for others who are still yelling in the dark, albeit far from the commercial limelight. Phil still tours, but now he does so in smaller venues where the audience can see the wrinkles on his forehead rather than in stadiums with tens of thousands of spectators. He makes no attempt to imitate Pantera. He doesn't revisit his childhood cries. He now delivers rawness to the stage. A man knocked down by life, standing only to demonstrate his survival, not to win. Phil seems to be creating his own will with each endeavor and song. A legacy that lingers eerily, yet is not glittering or easily assimilated. He once said, "I know I've hurt a lot of people. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want that. When someone listens to my music, they understand that I tried." For some, that's not enough. For others, it's the only thing that matters. Personal life. When the stage lights dimmed and the final drum beat faded, Phil Anselmo returned to a completely different world in no audience. No screaming, just a cold room, a body wrecked by pain, and a mind shattered by memories no one but him could truly understand. If the stage was where Phil fought with screams, then his personal life was a silent battlefield, one where he lost over and over again. Since the mid-1990s, Phil had been living with excruciating back pain caused by spinal injuries, the result of overperforming, falling off stage, and years of relentless physical strain. Doctors had advised him to rest completely, but instead, Phil chose to swallow handfuls of opioids, then turned to hard liquor and finally heroin, a drug that, as he once put it, temporarily killed the pain without having to think about tomorrow. For years, he lived a routine of self-poisoning, then stepped on stage like nothing had happened until his body could no longer take it. But drugs weren't the only thing eating away at Phil. Fame, adoration, and the image of being untouchable had turned him into a shell. Inside was a man who no longer knew how to love anyone, including himself. His personal life became closed off and cold. He was once married to Stephanie Opal Weinstein, a blues musician and longtime friend with whom he founded the project Southern Isolation, a band with a gloomy, lethargic tone that mirrored Phil's mood at the time. But the marriage didn't last. Phil was still too consumed by addiction, the stage, and his personal demons. He let love slip away as if it were inevitable. Phil has no children. When asked about it, he didn't dodge the question that, on the contrary, he answered with brutal honesty. "I didn't want to bring a life into this world when I couldn't even control my own. I used to think I didn't deserve to be a father, and I still think that loneliness became the default state of Phil Anselmo's life in the years after Pantera. In the early 2000s, he lived reclusively in a house on the outskirts of New Orleans, away from crowds, rarely seen in public outside of music projects. The death of Dime Bagdarrell in February 2004, who had once been a friend, bandmate, and brother on stage, felt like a knife driven straight into his heart. Though they hadn't been close for years, Phil never imagined their story would end with a cold-blooded onstage murder. After Dimebag's death, Phil became one of the most divisive figures in the metal community. Many blamed him for previous angry comments where he had said someone should give Dime a lesson, a statement he insisted was impulsive and never meant with malice. He apologized publicly. He wept on live television that he reached out to the Abbott family with deep remorse, but the apology was never accepted. Vinnie Paul, Dime's brother, cut off all contact with Phil until his own death in 2018. For many years, Phil lived like an exile from the very community he once ruled. But it was also during this time that he began quietly trying to rebuild, not with headlines or media campaigns, but with small actions. He started getting cleaned. He began eating healthier. He adopted pets, tended a garden, and with his longtime partner, Kate Richardson, a music manager and one of the few constant companions in his life, began piecing together what was left of his life. Kate didn't just help Phil find balance. She became the only person who made him believe he still deserved to live. Phil Anselmo's name is still often followed by controversy. The 2016 incident when he raised a Nazi salute and shouted white power on stage at a festival reignited public outrage. Once again, Phil bowed his head and apologized, calling it a stupid, drunken, indefensible act. And once again, his fans were left to wonder, has Phil really changed? The answer perhaps doesn't lie in his statements, but in the quiet things he's done since. The small-scale tours, the speeches about mental health, the rare moments of reflection on his past, and the apology to Dimebag he never stopped carrying with him. Phil Anselmo, a man who once reached the heights through screams, has spent most of his life in silence. And yet it is in that silence that we see him most clearly alone, weary, but never fully defeated. Present life. Nearly 3 decades after the fiery days of Panta, Phil Anselmo is still here, not as a living legend, but as a weathered ghost, still learning how to exist amid the wreckage of what was once destroyed. He no longer seeks the spotlight, doesn't chase trends, and certainly doesn't cling to old glories. Yet, in the quiet of New Orleans, Phil still lives, still writes music, still screams, but in a wholly different way. In 2024, just when many believed Phil had fully retreated into the shadows, he unexpectedly resurfaced with Scour, an extreme metal band with a ferocious lineup. That entire year, they performed only one show at Southport Hall in Louisiana, like a secret ritual with almost no promotion, no fanfare, no spectacle. That same year, Phil maintained one of his odd yet signature traditions, building a haunted house for Halloween, open to local residents.